meeting of the Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. The main item today is a discussion on tall buildings and fire safety. Could I ask everyone to check their electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid interruptions. Members of the public may like to follow @London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag Assembly Fire and Fire Safety for this meeting. Jonathan, any apologies for absence?
Yes, apologies for absence have been received from Assemblymember Bacon, for whom Assemblymember Arbour is substituting, and Assemblymember Curtin.
Thank you. Are there any other declarations of interest? And can we note those that are there? No? Thank you. Can we note the standing delegation of authority to the chair of the committee as set out on the agenda and as agreed at the London Assembly plenary meeting on the 6th of June?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we agree with the minutes of the committee meeting on the 23rd of May?
Agreed.
Thank you. And can we note the completed and ongoing actions?
Noted.
Thank you. Which brings us to today's main item, discussion on tall buildings and fire safety. Can I welcome our guests, Dan Daly, old friend of ours, Nick Coombe from the London Fire Brigade, Charlie Pugsley, Fire Safety Specialist Teams at the Brigade, Pat Turnball from the London Tenants Federation, Martin Boyd, the chair of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, welcome, Martin Conlon, who's a Building Control Professional Group Chair of the RICS, welcome, Pat Hayes, Managing Director of BeFirst Regeneration. I think that's everybody. Thank you all for coming, and perhaps I can start with the first questions. I think this is probably for Dan and Charlie to start with. How do you define a high-rise residential building?
Afternoon, Andrew, members of the panel. I think for us in London Fire Brigade, we've been talking now for a number of years around buildings over 18 metres, and certainly that's a figure you'll all be very familiar with in the sort of post-Grenfell era and the work that we've been doing. I think the issues for us more broadly around building safety is really about the risk within that building. So whilst we can define high-rise buildings, using ADB as a guide around 6 floors, 18 metres as a common sort of pathway, I think our concerns are more broad in terms of the work that we've been doing post-Grenfell around building safety, the whole regulatory regime, and looking to improve that. So it's a broader conversation, I think, rather than just talking about tall buildings.
Okay, so if we took that one in Barking for an example, that wouldn't be classed as a tall building?
It certainly wasn't over 18 metres by that definition, no.
Okay. So what are you doing to raise awareness of fire safety in high-rise residential buildings?
So I think, again, we've had a very solid programme of prevention work with London's communities. A number of our prevention practitioners work through providing information to specific groups, whether it's around health and vulnerability, to residents of purpose-built blocks of flats. We provide information on our external website with lots of self-help tools for people to understand their risk from fire and how to manage and reduce that risk. And more proactively, we've had our home fire safety visit schedule, which lots of people around this table will be aware of. Currently around 80,000 of those are conducted every year, and 80% of those are with what we class as P1 vulnerable people. So the advice hasn't really changed around what are the main causes of fire and what people can do to keep themselves safe. I mean, I know we're here to talk about tall buildings, but tragically for us, fire deaths and injuries happen in a range of buildings across London. And it's more linked to the behaviours and vulnerabilities of individuals rather than where they live in London.
Okay, well, I might come back to some of that later on.
Yeah.
You presumably are also working with responsible persons under the RRO. Mm-hmm. How engaged and proactive on fire safety are the RPs who you deal with?
I think it's fair to say we've had a mixed response, by and large. I think we've been very, very careful not to step into the space of fire risk assessors and competent person advice for the RPs, but we've certainly been there to challenge some of the advice that they have had. The most proactive, I think, are where we've enjoyed decent relationships and been able to add value to the advice that they've taken. And we've also had those challenges. I think members will be aware from previous discussions around some of the challenges we had with some large developers in some instances. But I'm pleased to say, certainly with some of the work Charlie did in one particular instance, we were able to make progress there. So I don't think we're meeting huge resistance at the moment, but there is still this issue with private premises and the issues around engaging and encouraging those private RPs to take action in their buildings, where we're currently concerned about the cladding of fascia systems on those buildings.
Well, we'll be coming back to that later on.
I thought we might.
Perhaps I could ask the two Pats and Martin, What's the most common fire safety issues in high-rise that were brought to your attention? I'm going to start with Pat Hayes and work along.
I mean, I think the issue with the buildings that we're taking down and at the moment is the means of escape in terms of number of stairwells. All our current stock, which is defined as high, is essentially either brick built or bison framed. There's an issue around degassing some of the bison blocks still. We've still got a couple of those blocks. Again, they're fairly advanced in demolition. So I think it's, if one sets the management position to one side, the main structural issues for us are means of escape, sprinkler systems, and then, any other inherited sort of hazards with blocks, particularly the bison ones. And as we knock them down, then they'll be replaced clearly with blocks built to a very different standard.
Well, I'd like to agree with what the fire chief said.
I wish I was.
Not quite chief yet. You never know. You never know.
In that, if you start to define tall buildings in a certain way and say everything else is going to be okay, you're going to make a big mistake, because fires can happen anywhere, and the Barking example of a 6-storey building has just been referred to. Other issues we are concerned about are accessibility for firefighters, like space to park and get the ladders to where they're required. This was also an issue at Grenfell, I think. Just to go on to what we've done about raising awareness, because I think that was your other question. We discussed the Hackett review on the basis of a paper produced by one of our members. We discussed safe homes in general at our conference last October 2018. Two of our representatives, myself and another, attended your fire safety summit and reported back to London Tenants Federation about it. And tomorrow, unfortunately it's tomorrow, but tomorrow we're organising an event called the Government Consultation Reforms of Regulation to High-Rise Residential Dwellings, where we've got speakers Phil Murphy and Stuart Hodkinson, who wrote this excellent book, Safe as Houses. So what we'd like to do is, once we've had that meeting, also report back to you our further thoughts. We're strongly in favour of sprinklers in new build and retrofitting, and we've consistently supported that. And we think that the immediate challenges to remediate high-rise buildings with unsafe cladding, this really has to be sorted out faster than it has been up to now. I know the government has said they're providing funding for social rented homes, but there is a problem, which is not really our remit, of course, of all the other ones. And we're also concerned that the funding that the government gave came out of the funding for affordable housing overall. And we're concerned too that, apart from the question of cladding, there are other elements of fire safety procedures that, now that councils are looking at them very closely, are finding need things done about them, and urgently, and we're concerned that the money to address those problems is going to come out of the council tenants' rents, and is therefore going to leave less to be spent on essential upkeep, and in the end that's going to create yet more problems. So these are some of our concerns about the situation.
Martin and Martin.
Me first?
Yeah.
I'd like to put it into two categories. First, from the RICS point of view, and the building control. Under new build, I think one of the biggest problems is lack of fire stopping. I think we see that. I don't think I can think of a project where fire stopping and cavity barriers have been properly installed. It's just a lack of it, and it's a lack of understanding and appreciation. I think from existing buildings that are undergoing retrofit, I think it's a massive disconnect and a lack of understanding that if you have a building that was built in the 1960s and you suddenly decide to overclad it, to insulate it, irrespective of what the cladding is made of, you are altering the fire dynamics within that building automatically. And that can make a massive difference. So there's a lack of understanding of when people retrofit or refurbish buildings in lots of areas, they're doing potential damage and issues, and they're not considering those. And I think there's been a disconnect. The regulations clearly have been shown to be, and the guidance of the regulations has been shown to be lacking in lots of areas. I think that the government are trying to address that. Whether they're addressing it properly or not is another matter. We may need to revisit that. And I think there's also, in generally, a lack of disconnect within the whole construction and handover process. I think from conception and inception of the project right to completion and then into operation beyond, there are many gaps. The government have introduced, or trying to introduce, this so-called golden thread, which I think is essential, but it's actually how that operates in practice. It's like crazy paving is this. There's lots of gaps in it. There's lots of gaps in it that need to be addressed. And it's a whole system.
Martin.
Yeah, well, I shan't claim to have any technical knowledge of buildings at all, but what has been very clear from the outset is we have two sometimes competing sets of legislation dealing with this issue. We have all the building safety regulations and legislation, and then we have the leasehold tenure legislation, and they just don't join up on occasions. And we've used the term the building owner, and that is perfectly reasonable term to use from a building safety point of view, but from the landlord and tenant leaseholder perspective, it is utterly meaningless. In the private sector, a building owner, what they really own is the ground rent reversion and the right to control the management of the building. Their financial interest in that building may be as little as 1%, and very often what the building owner is a piece of paper in a drawer sitting in an offshore territory, and it's impossible for the government to force those sort of entities to actually look after the building in the way that they want them to.
Well, that's what brings me to the next question, which is for you and Turnball, which is how easy do residents find it to get fire safety problems dealt with in a timely manner by landlords or building owners or whoever you want to refer to them as?
Well, I think given that we are now 2 years after Grenfell, the fairly obvious answer to that is leaseholders find it extremely difficult. And what's been clear is there seems to have been a lack of consistency from government. We are going through a constantly changing understanding of what constitutes safe and unsafe cladding, and until the barking fire, wooden cladding on the outside of the building was perfectly acceptable. Now suddenly people are living in homes where that's no longer deemed to be safe. And we've had the same sort of issue in terms of the government advice to local authorities. They were repeatedly told that they had the powers under the 2004 Act to take control of these buildings and do something about them. And then suddenly in February this year, the government updated their advice on the 2004 Act because they finally accepted it wasn't working. And there are a number of local authorities who fed in to the government to say they're still not happy that the powers that they have would allow them to do anything without passing those costs to the leaseholders. So I think there's unfortunately a feeling from the leaseholders that they have a lack of control as to what's going on. There has been very much mixed messages being sent to them. A lot of them have faced very high costs, and they still have no idea really what's going to happen to solve this problem in the end.
From the tenant's point of view, Pat?
What's your question? Just
sorry.
remind me.
Yeah. Well, the question was how easy or otherwise do residents find it to get fire safety issues dealt with?
Well, residents find it difficult to get anything about their homes dealt with, which is due to a whole variety of factors. The most difficult one being that so much of the work that's done in our homes is subcontracted and then subcontracted again. And now tenants are being expected to liaise directly with the subcontractors rather than with their landlord, which just creates further problems. So I think that there needs to be clarification about how tenants can get things done. I think the idea of having a regulator, we supported Shelter in asking for a regulator, and the possibility of tenants, where necessary, being able to go directly to the regulator is important. But of course the regulator then has to have the powers to do something about whatever the tenant is concerned about.
Okay, thanks. Coming back to the Brigade, what regular checks and inspections do you undertake to assess fire safety in high-rise residential buildings?
So high-rise buildings will just be one of the premises types within our sort of risk-based inspection programme. So they don't, or traditionally they've not posed a huge risk in terms of fire safety part, but it's something that we've included within our risk-based inspection programme. But certainly since Grenfell, we've had an active programme of dealing with buildings that were identified to us where there were concerns about the external cladding on the building. We've maintained a dialogue where we found not just issues with the external envelope of the building, but also issues with compartmentation, fire doors, and the general fire safety management within those premises. As you'll be aware, I think we've currently in London got something like 215 buildings where there are simultaneous evacuation procedures in place as part of the interim measures associated with the risks within those buildings. And we're maintaining an active watch of those through fire stations, just to make sure those arrangements are still in place. Each of those buildings that we first assessed, we issued with a notice of deficiencies to ensure that there was a written record of the issues we felt needed to be picked up, and we will be reviewing those. So there's clearly a need for us to maintain a presence in high-rise buildings to assist with public reassurance, and equally to provide a bit of an outlet for residents in terms of their concerns. So just before I hand to Nick, I mean, Nick's got something to add here. There is, in terms of the issues being raised, your point about residents, we've certainly seen an increase in general fire safety queries into London Fire Brigade, and we've put extra resource into managing the help desk where we service those queries. I mean, fortunately, we've not seen a huge number of significant safety risks elevated through that process, but what we are seeing is a general awareness and interest amongst residents, and we've been able to provide information either through the website or recommending home fire safety visits and so on to sort of help allay their fears, which I think is an important part of the service we're providing. It's not just about the building, it's that reassurance piece as well. Sorry, Nick.
Thanks. I think you need to understand as well that the limited powers the fire service have got in residential blocks of flats. We only cover the common areas.
Yep.
The fire safety order is built on the assumption that the building would have been built in the first place, because it's a lot about maintenance and management. And, you know, we don't cover the external bit. And also we have no real powers to access flats. It's people that are at risk, and it's people, what they do in their flats that can actually cause the problem. And like the issues you've heard around landlords getting access, we can't even check the front door, because unless we can get them to open it, it's really difficult to check it even as a self-closer. So, you know, part of the new framework going forward needs to allow whoever's going to be the regulator in them buildings to have the access they need to ensure that the holistic whole building approach works in them types. You've got two pieces of legislation. The coroner at Lacanau highlighted that these don't work together, and it was never rectified at that time, and it's still to be rectified now. But the consultations are out, and they specifically asked them questions, so hopefully in the future we can fix that issue.
And Dan, you talked about not just looking at high-rise, but vulnerable people and places more generally. How do you decide which are the ones that pose the greatest risk, and to what extent does that apply to high-rise?
So I think we've got a risk matrix that talks about the risk in buildings, and certainly that's been around for a number of years now. And that's something that we've sought to review over the last few years, but with events where they are, and now consultations around what constitutes high-risk buildings being part of that, and something that we're actively pushing very, very firmly on, is that the extent of the review under the Hackett recommendations considers high-risk buildings to be more than just high-rise, and certainly thinking about specialised housing, care homes, those places where vulnerable residents live. So it's a bit of work I think we still need to come back to the outcome of where we are and what definitions are put in place through the changes that we're facing now. But certainly we use fire data as well to inform where fires happen. We think about the types of people, as I say, the vulnerabilities that lead to fires occurring. And all of that comes together in a blend, really, to determine where we should go. I think we are still some way off where I would like to be in terms of really targeting risk as firmly as I'd like, because there's always been a pressure around the number of audits that we would have achieved as a service. I think what we're pushing for now is a tighter reflection on what risk needs to be tackled by the specialists that we have in the fire safety department, and equally where we find those risks and where we tackle RPs that aren't taking their responsibility seriously, that we have tighter regulation and higher rates of enforcement to bring people to book where we find it.
I'm doing enforcement in a minute, but have you actually got a written policy or document which says these are the ones we particularly need to look out for? I presume that's not in the London Safety Plan. I don't think it was when I last looked at it. So we looked at the London Safety Plan before, 2 years on. Are you looking to have that somehow set out as a document, as a supplement to the London Safety Plan, or for next time round?
So you know we'll be working through developing the next London Safety Plan probably around the same sort of time as we're looking for outcomes from the current consultation. So hopefully if those two things align, it will enable us to do that. I'm not sure that a huge amount changes for me just thinking about where we think risk is at the moment. We do, as I say, we do set down where we think fires are likely to happen and where we want to focus our efforts. And I'd like to think that in the LSP we'll be able to give some reassurance around where those things are going forward. But I don't see that risk changes because, as I say, it's more closely aligned to vulnerabilities and people's behaviours than necessarily what it is around the types of buildings. However, all that said, there is still something there about public reassurance and making sure people feel safe in their homes. So maintaining a presence in those places, I think, is hugely important as well. So
coming back to non-compliance, which you just mentioned, how many non-compliant high-rise have you identified in the last couple of years? And what action, you've talked about notices of deficiencies. What other actions have you taken? I understand from the mayoral question I had answered that you've not taken any formal action against any RPs as yet. Is that still the case?
Yeah, I don't think we've needed to. So in our normal methodology, we wouldn't necessarily have issued nods to all of those high-rise buildings. They would have potentially come down broadly compliant in terms of the issues that we have access to, as Nick's just described. However, because there is this additional risk around the cladding, we felt it prudent to actually use a higher rate of enforcement around using notice of deficiencies to record what we expected RPs to be doing with that particular building. So it kind of gave us a figure where we were looking at over 700 premises, I believe we ended up issuing nods on, having carried out sort of in excess of 1,400 visits to different premise types, of high-rise types. So that's the kind of levels we've been at. I think what we've learnt from the high-rise work, though, is that we need our officers to be able to do more than simply audit a premises, and that was a change that came around through the better regulation process. We need our officers to have the skills and abilities to be able to look deeper into buildings where initial signs and symptoms don't give them the feeling that the buildings are being managed as we'd like. So we've encouraged that, and we've developed our officers to have that ability. And of course, I think you'll be aware that we've recently used that methodology and taken it forward into another premises type around care homes, where we did a limited sample of 177 care homes and found that 104 of those then required enforcement of some nature, which is a much higher rate than we would normally see. So I think we are seeing across the piece higher rates of enforcement. That's interesting for me, it's useful, it's where I want to be. But I think part of that messaging within the higher rates of enforcement has to be there's still a desire from us to see people being compliant with the regulations by consent. I don't want them simply stopping because the inspectors have turned up or they've seen the speed camera, to use another analogy. We want 24/7, 365 days of the year compliance with the fire safety regulations.
Now, I can understand that prosecutions further down the field, down the track, if you get people to work with you to sort it out. There'd be no prosecution so far 2 years on.
Yeah.
But presumably there must be some sort of triage system you're operating in terms of the seriousness of the defects you find and go back to doing inspections. Have you found RPs who are not prepared to cooperate with you where you're contemplating prosecutions?
I think in those areas where we traditionally have the remit to inspect, the common parts, as Nick said, we've not found the resistance. I think the issues are really around the cladding systems and the uncertainty and funding and availability, the issues that have been spoken about by colleagues here. That has led to the debates, if you like, and the challenges with RPs. I think more generally in the traditional areas of general fire safety practice, I think people have got on board with what we
from me
found.
before Bingley Onion. Joint Inspection Task Force, government announced a year ago, well, 2 years ago, it was, it just set up. That's right, is it? And as I understand it, there are only 2 people in it.
It's not quite right. It's a small central team, but they will use the resources of the local authority in which they're carrying out the inspections. I think, Nick, you can probably give an update on where we might be with that.
You're right, there's been some wranglings around the effectiveness of the team through indemnity insurance, exactly that, because they're only going to offer advice to the local team who will have to carry out the enforcement under the HHSRS, which is their tool to use. It's been slow, I can't argue with that. With my other hat on as NFCC, we provided fire engineering support to that team, and my understanding is the first inspection to use enforcement is imminent. But again, the legislation is they have to give a letter to every single resident in the block, advising that they're coming. They then have to give separate letters to the people responsible. They then have to give separate letters to the people who they want to go in their flats, because without that they can't get in. And it's clear that even with the joint inspection, the HHSRS is not fit for blocks of flats because it wasn't particularly designed for that. So it is slow, and there are reasons behind that. But hopefully, when the first inspection carries on and enforcement happens, the idea is once it's challenged through first-tier tribunals and they win, then the rest will fall into place a lot easier. And it's providing support. They don't need a lot of people. They need local authority EHOs who are going to carry it out to be sure that they are going down the right track, and they've got some expertise in there that's providing that.
So they're advising the local authorities.
Yes.
So the action is on the side on the part of the local authorities to take effect.
Yes.
Are the local authorities sufficiently staffed up to do it?
I can't, because I don't work for it. I can't answer that. I mean, I can only give you a general answer that most public sector have reduced resources. But we've got 33 London boroughs. This is a high risk event. You've got external wall systems that are non-compliant that could cause risk. And I think they have to go through this route of going through enforcement to get it taken down, because RPs are not doing what they're meant to do. But then they have other issues about have they actually physically got the money to replace £2 million worth of cladding. That's the issue. Where does that money come from? I think the government today is announcing how to apply for the private sector fund. But again, that's only about the actual ACM and not what else is wrong with that building.
Yeah.
Okay, just before I come to the other questions I want to ask, I mean, you said no prosecutions of RPs, registered providers. I mean, I'm certainly aware of one example in my own constituency, Clyde House, owned or managed by A2 Dominion, where there's been sparking electrics and water, and it is an accident waiting to happen, and people have been trying to get A2D to step up and sort all of this out. I mean, it may be something that you can write to me separately about from this meeting, but it's a good example. It seems to me A2D is one of these really large associations, and I was actually really shocked and horrified at the condition of the building, and really appallingly dangerous conditions for the people that live there. So I'm slightly worried that we're still saying no prosecutions, because I think in cases like that, I mean, surely, I don't necessarily want to use the, an example should be made terminology or anything like that, but I do wonder, what do you actually have to do to take, to be prosecuted?
It is a building I'm familiar with. I can't remember the details of it, exactly where we're at, but I think one of the misconceptions is that the fire service can fix everything. And we really can't. So as those areas...
No, I think it's A2D that should be fixing it.
Absolutely, but in terms of our ability to force them down that line. So if the areas to which we can regulate and enforce, there aren't the issues there for us to take further action, then we can't. There might be other issues that are more related around housing and the Housing Act and things that local authorities should be stepping in on. And I can't remember the specific details, so it'd be wrong for me to just make a guess at this, but I know we have been fully engaged with Clyde House.
Absolutely, I know that is the case. I'm just concerned that there seems to be some form of blockage around, you know, who is actually going to make people who are managing buildings that people are, you know, potentially in danger. And I mean, you're from the fire service, so it's probably even more of a concern to you than it is to me. You know, how do we make this not happen?
I think some of that, sorry, I think it comes back to some of the points that were made earlier, that residents need to have a clear line of sight to where they can make those complaints, and those complaints are actioned quickly. As I say, we've taken steps in London Fire Brigade to make sure residents that are raising concerns with us, there's someone on the end of the phone to take those calls and to answer those responses. Often the issues that are raised with us aren't issues that we can directly affect, but we can certainly provide some sort of advice and support to certainly alleviate some of that anxiety. But I absolutely understand where residents will find that frustration, and I think colleagues here have sort of alluded to that.
I think you'll find actually that, as Dan's quite said, that there's a perception that the fire brigade can be all things to all people and deal with everything, but that theirs is a particular limited set of legislation which is not helpful in this case. However, the local authority do have powers, and they have fairly extensive powers. Certainly under the Building Act, Section 77 deals with dangerous buildings or structures, and it actually says that if a building is in such a condition to be dangerous, then the local authority can take action. They have powers. So there are powers available. There also is Section 78 where there's emergency powers if the condition is imminently dangerous. So you have two types of danger, an imminent danger or you have a potential danger, what I call Section 77. But Section 77 requires to go through the courts. Section 78 gives the local authority power to take action immediately, should that be necessary.
Then, of course, there's the issue about how many officers local authorities still have
that's right, that's
given
the whole
the
issue
reduction in funding to them and
Correct,
austerity.
Absolutely. The powers are there, it's whether the personnel's there to exercise those powers
exactly.
is another matter.
That's a slightly separate debate, but it does, mentioning regulations does actually bring me on to the area that Andrew was anticipating that I would be asking about. And I think I'm probably coming to the Brigade on that. And that's, you know, about when we're finding developers developing new buildings, you know, there is a point there where the Brigade does have the opportunity to be consulted. 20,000, you know, submissions a year in terms of building and planning. How many of the responses where you've made recommendations or you've said, don't think that's going to work in the way that you've designed that, how many of the recommendations are taken on board, and if you've asked for any changes, how many of those get changed? I'm not sure whether that's
I'm not sure if I have the figures here. Charlie might have in some paper he's got there, but it's on the general point of that. One of the major frustrations for us as a service is that we are a statutory consultee. However, people don't have to take our advice on board. And one clear example there is we've been consistently now in a number of premises types recommending sprinklers as part of that consultation process. And there is very limited to zero take up on some of those recommendations. I'll probably say off the top of my head.
Wow.
I think I've got a highly skilled team of fire engineers that are able to
just
provide
to be
that.
absolutely clear, you're saying that you have recommended that sprinklers are installed, and there have been instances where the people that you've sent that to, who are property developers, have said, thanks but no thanks.
Absolutely.
And that's post-Grenfell?
That will be post-Grenfell, and it will be in the years before that. So there are a huge amount of frustrations. We've got a skilled team of engineers who make recommendations out of their professional judgment around public safety. And it is appalling that doesn't have to be taken on board by developers. It's a frustration for me. It's something that we've asked within the review, that those advices are taken on board more readily. I think it is...
it's pretty astonishing that a statutory consultation, a statutory consultee can make strong recommendations about what would be best in terms of fire, and then someone just can completely ignore it, and there's literally no comeback.
Absolutely, and if we think about the building regulations, there are areas of the building regulations and the process where people are able to interpret what the meaning of the regulation is, and that's one of the things we're seeking clarity on in the technical review, and we've certainly fed into that. There are also areas within the building regulations where people may want to deviate from prescribed standards, and within that is an implied procedure where there'll be agreement with the fire service and the developer around what the solution is to that extension away from prescriptive measures. And well, I'm not sure that that's always taken on board either. And I look enviously at some other fire services around the world where they have powers to not only stop buildings from being developed, where developments are taking place without the fire service approval, they also have the powers to stop those things. So we end up in a very difficult situation, and there is a case in London where we're looking very closely. Over 2 years ago, we provided recommendations around the design of that building that was unsafe, and we would not support the development. The development has nonetheless gone ahead. It is now an occupied building, and we are now looking at that through our regulatory role to see what we can do, what action we can take. There are other buildings that, subsequent to our advice and planning at early design stage, that were ignored, that now they've come to having completed the building and carrying out active tests in the building. The failures that were identified in principle by our engineers are coming to fruition in reality, and there are now expensive retrofits being undertaken in those buildings. It staggers me, with all those lessons out there, that people are still not taking the advice. And that's not to say just advice on the fire brigade. I think more generally the fire service do have a voice.
Well, I must say, I find myself, it's hard to feel sympathetic to people who are being forced into those kind of expensive retrofits, because they could have listened to you in the first place. I see that Nick wants to come in.
I think, again, we need to clarify the process. The fire service are not building control experts. No. It comes to us on the knowledge that the building control body have said it's ready to go. And so we should only really be commenting on would it meet our legislation if built like that. But we are increasingly commenting on stuff that isn't correct. And there are issues around, and my bugbear is around, there was a major fatality fire a few years ago where they had to refurbish that building. It's over 30 metres. Did they then put sprinklers in it, even though it's now saying you should? No, they hid behind the non-worsening clause. Did they upgrade any of the firefighting facilities there? No, because they hid behind a clause that says, if I'm not making it worse. So if you can't get a building owner who has had a multiple fatality death in that building to improve it when it gets the chance, that's what you're up against. And until they are made to do things, like made to put sprinklers in, because we can say it's a good idea, because it's a great idea, but we've got no power. Until it's mandated, they will not do it, because it's all about money, not public.
I think Martin wanted to come in.
That is really...
It's a good point on the consultation. First of all, you're right, it's a statutory consultation, and there is a consultation protocol and procedure that is recommended to follow between building control and the fire authority. And Nick's quite right. What should happen is that the application for consultation should go to the fire authority once building control is reasonably satisfied that it complies with approved document B or the regulations surrounding approved document B. I think I'm getting feedback all too often is that many building control bodies are wanting the fire brigade to more or less check the plan for them, and then just sort of sit back and say, well, I'm more or less washing their hands of it from that point of view, which I find unacceptable from that point of view. So I do share your frustration there. I also share the frustration, the fact that the statutory consultation, I don't know, years ago, I sound like a grumpy old man here. Years ago, when I was actively involved in building control, we had a very, very close relationship with the local fire authority where I worked. And that, for some reason, seems to have dissipated throughout the country as I'm speaking to people. The close working relationship doesn't seem to be there as much. And I don't know quite why, whether that's down to cost savings, changes in staff personnel, changes in politics or structure, I don't know. But that close working relationship doesn't seem to be there anymore. It seems to be much lacking. So this idea that there's a disconnect, there's a lot of disconnections throughout the whole system where you would expect that things should be smooth and relatively straightforward. And they're not. They're not. Also, with on the legislation, is a good point. At the RICS, we're developing a group for international fire safety standards, where we're talking with all sorts of. We have a group which across the world really, where we're actually sharing advice and guidance and information, and good practice, to be quite honest as well. That's relatively in its infancy. It's only been going for about a year. And that's developing sort of an understanding as to where other people are finding difficulties, where we are, but also how other people are finding solutions to some of those difficulties in relation to fire safety standards across the world. And I think that's a good point to consider. But I like Dan and Nick, I share these frustrations, the fact that there are situations that people, where there's very little powers that we can do.
Pat wanted to come in as well.
Well, can I just follow up that point about building control that you were just making, and then Martin was coming in. Sorry Pat, to cut you off there. Is one of the reasons why there's been the dissipation of that close working relationship the fact that the arrangements have now been changed so that if someone is building something, they no longer have to use the building control inspection service of the local authority. They can now employ their own independent or quasi-independent person that they pay to come in and do some of these things. Do you think that's having an impact, and perhaps that's also leading to the greater workload and the need for greater review by the fire service? Would you say that that might be the case?
It could be a factor. I'm not suggesting that it is the only factor. It could be a factor.
No, I'm not saying it's the only thing.
I think it could be a factor. I mean, there are elements of good practice within the public and the private sector. Equally, there's elements of bad practice in both sections as well. So I think there's, because I've also been in the private sector, and in the private sector I've had some very good relationships with some excellent fire authorities, where we have a clear understanding. And we've done joint completion inspections on major projects where we've understood each other's point of view. We've invited the fire authority to come along and inspect while we're undergoing inspections, while the place is being fitted out, which has actually helped not only ourselves but the developer in making sure that they're meeting all their standards. So, you know, I would say it might be a factor in some certain situations, but I wouldn't say it's the only factor.
No, sorry.
Pat wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, it was really just to reiterate from the planning authority point of view, our frustration a lot of the time in terms of advice around fire safety and indeed other things can be ignored, and there's very little we can do about that. One of the things that we're trying to develop at the moment effectively is an informal process where developers sign up to go hack it plus effectively at planning application stage to see if we can at least encourage the good ones and hopefully shame the less good ones to follow suit. I differ slightly. I do think there is that the increased and use of improved inspectors has been very unhelpful in many ways. I mean, there are some very good improved inspectors. There are also some not so good improved inspectors who are operating on a fairly pared down budget and will cut corners, and if that means getting the fire brigade to do a bit of their work, great. If that means not quite doing it as they would have done traditionally, again, they do it. And I do think that the use of improved inspectors and the way that effectively that's impacted on the local authority building control side, and just our sheer difficulty recruiting. I've been trying to recruit building control officers, and it's enormously difficult because it's a profession that has aged. A lot of people have gone into the work in the improved inspector sector. You're training people up from scratch effectively, or trying to get people at the end of their career to come back into the public sector. And it is really difficult, and it does knock through in terms of those long-standing relationships. The relationship between building control and planning, relationship between building control and the fire brigade.
To say that's very much been my perception, and trying to deal with some of these people as a councillor or assembly member has been more difficult than dealing with the local authority building control department. Very much the point that you're making about the recruitment, and actually I think there are some difficulties in local authorities in maintaining those teams.
Yeah. And a lot of the approved inspectors do attempt to do as much work as they can as a desktop exercise. I've dealt with people in Cardiff, and it's been a bit of a job to come to London and actually look at their own building.
Yes, could I ask you, Pat, or possibly Martin, this one? I mean, a planning authority could not make it a planning condition that the sort of things that Danny's talking about is part of the development, or could they use that as a ground for refusal?
I think you'd be a brave planning authority to do that, because the chances they'd appeal and that you'd lose at appeal and would have costs awarded against you.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
So I think Dan was suggesting that Charlie might be able to help on the 20,000 that are going in, how many of them are actually taken up in terms of the recommendations, and also do you sort of monitor I mean, it sounds as though you know of a number of cases. Is there a sort of monitoring process that you follow to find out how many have been taken up or just ignored?
Good afternoon. The first point, in terms of the building control consultations, the more complex type, which are tall or complex buildings, when we get those submissions in, we're looking over a 4-year period of between 60 to 70% of those we have to go back to them and make a recommendation on. And then after sending that back, the figures are still around 50 to 60%, whereby it comes back. There's still an issue even after we've been back on the first time. Now, as part of that work, we've also started doing an in-depth study, like a deep audit or inspection from a fire engineer perspective. We've sampled 20 buildings, and so far, although we're still putting the data together, we only found that one was actually what we call exemplary to a high standard. So if only 1 in 20 that's gone through that process is found to be to a good or high standard, and obviously for us, we think don't just strive for the base level, try to be good or great. That really shows an issue. On the plus side, our engineers are working with stakeholders from public and private sector to try and go back and, rather than, I think the colleagues raised the issue about just getting the fire service to do part of their role, because there is this real issue of capacity with our specialist and skilled staff, not just in the fire service, but this is also reflected at London Council's Fire Safety Group. It's an unfair burden for us to, in effect, be doing paid work for them. So we are looking at going back and pushing back and saying, no, you actually have to give us a reasonable consultation. So as an example, we'll get more detail sometimes on a simple building, and a complex building we get a few pages. So then that takes up our engineers' time, and in terms of what we would expect in terms of them reducing risk to the public, it really is challenging. One other piece of work, just tying in with Pat, that we are looking at as well as working with the police. For 30 years they've had success with developing secured by design. So we're currently in consultation as part of our collaborative working about SPD Part 2 or safe and secure by design. So again, if as one of these threads across the industry we can get at the planning and design stage developers to be more involved, so security, safety, inclusion and accessibility, we believe that we can't just do the reactive piece of work, we have to also be doing very much the work that's going to perhaps take a few years, but we will see the benefits as that comes forward.
It just makes so much more sense, doesn't it, to make a building accessible and secure by design, and to put in the right fireproofing that you need to at the beginning, rather than trying to go back and do it all afterwards. Sorry, Martin.
Well, yes, I think one of the problems, there are many, is that quite often when an application comes in for building control and fire authority approval, it's not a completed design. You know, the concept of design and build as an issue these days is a major problem within the industry, I feel. I've come across that the design has not been developed fully or appropriately at all. So all you get are sketch plans, and then you're expected to, you know, try and play catch up as the place is being built, because neither the building control nor the fire authority have any powers to stop developers building. We don't have stop notices, unfortunately. So that itself is an issue where you find quite often there's very little information that comes in, and then as the builder develops, you find things are changing on site on a regular basis, which actually have a massive impact on the fire, not just the fire part of the building, but there's maybe the structure, maybe the thermal aspect, maybe the accessibility, as well as the fire.
Pat Turnball wanted to come in.
Sorry, Pat.
Well, I think the problem is we've reached the results of the weakening of building regulations over at least 15 years. So, for example, I've got a short list here. There are loopholes for refurbishment work. There's self-certification of too much building work. There are problems with the qualifications and role of building inspectors, limited enforcement powers, and poor records of a building and what has happened to it. I mean, there's a building that I've been taking an interest in because council tenants live in it, where it's been swathed in scaffolding for a year now with a whole series of tests. They've got fire wardens on 24-hour duty so that they can be evacuated if something happens, and still there's no report of what actually is the problem with the building. And I think one of the proposals from the Hackett review is for a joint competent authority which would have a record of a building's entire life and take checks on the building every year, and those would be reported to the residents in the building so everybody would know everything about it. These things have become absolutely essential because of the lax sort of regime that's been operating for many years now. I mean, since Grenfell, I've been taking an interest in it, and as you say, there are things that just shock you. I read an example, for example, the reason why the fire brigade is not involved is you can hire your own fire expert, and they will do, you know, they'll say, yeah, this is what you need to do in your building. And there was a report from the fire expert in one building who was a person who used to work in the fire service, so he knew what he was saying. And he actually advised them on all the things that were wrong, but he also told them they didn't have to actually do anything about them, and they didn't have to publicise what he had told them. Now, this is just, you know, how can we expect proper safe standards when this is the sort of thing that's going on?
Well, I mean, I think that begs the question, and the answer seems to be, you know, we obviously can't. But just to come back to the sort of impact on the brigade, you're talking about, you know, the need for doing these deep dives to see how effectively your recommendation has been taken up. You're talking about, you know, 70% of your recommendations, you're still coming back and finding 50 to 60 haven't implemented. Obviously, this has quite significant resource implications from the point of view of the brigade. This was something that the Commissioner was talking in 2018 about enhancing the inspection capacity of the brigade. Is that something that you've been able to do? And do you feel, is there either a skills gap there in the brigade still, people that you need to skill up to do these inspections, and also, you know, money is the bit of the hidden elephant here. Is there also enough money to make sure that you've got the teams in the brigade, leaving aside the issue about whether or not you make recommendations that are then ignored by...
No, it's a point we've talked about a number of times around the sort of general competency across the sector. So it is broader than just the fire service, and I will come back to my own personal pressures around staffing, but there is sector competency as an issue. I think you've seen some examples of where people can declare as risk assessors without necessarily a suitable set of qualifications and third-party review to say they are actually up to the role. We've got fire engineers that work for us that are chartered fire engineers. Unfortunately, it's not a protected term, so you may declare yourself as a fire engineer with, I suggest, as much as a first aid certificate, I don't know. But certainly not where we'd like to see some of that stuff. But the sector itself is hugely challenged in terms of competency.
It's still a big challenge. And
it's still a big challenge for us. So inside London Fire Brigade, we had some funding from the Mayor a couple of years back now. And we've tried to make that funding work in ways that support the competency of our existing officers. So it wasn't about putting more officers on the ground. It was about making sure those officers were confident and able to do a deeper dive where necessary, to understand the challenges in the built environment more than they possibly did before, because it's hugely dynamic out there. I mean, London, you know, unashamedly, we have got one of the most dynamic cities in terms of the build and design and the way innovation is driving buildings forward, and materials and use of materials. And that's a huge sort of church to stay across, really. So for our IOs, they need to be supported in that. We took the decision not to recruit any IOs for a period of time to ensure that we actually consolidated what our IOs knew and were able to do the job, so that when we brought new IOs in, which we've been doing now for the last year or so, that they are able to be mentored and supported by competent and qualified IOs, because that wasn't the situation a few years back, because we were driving on quantity of audits rather than thinking about the challenges. And I think we're now all too aware what those challenges are. We will be submitting a different budget request this year to try and address that. But that budget request also comes with a plea that we will need the time to develop the individuals within that, because there just isn't the market out there to go and buy the skills into the brigade. Where those skills are available, there's an absolute premium out there at the moment that is hugely challenging, and we are going to be suggesting within our our staffing model going forward, something that's a bit different and innovative for London Fire Brigade, to try and ensure we can retain and attract people to come and work for us. But we're not going to be able to bridge that gap. I think Charlie's got a bit of work on this as well.
Well, no, if I can just add, is that we've not tried to just carry on doing things the same way, because it's incumbent on us to, if there is an issue, what else can we do? So, for example, one of our new engineers in training is a chemical engineer. So, because there isn't the skills out there, we've taken somebody from another discipline that shows the, if you like, the base understanding of those skills, brought them in, and she's doing really well, and we're hoping to have her fully qualified in 2 years, which is shorter than the normal 3-year minimum term, because she can go straight to doing a master's. So in other words, it makes financial and organisational sense to try these new things. You sometimes get hidden benefits, like when there's an environmental audit committee report on furniture and furnishing regulations, we've got somebody who says, oh, I know about this. So again, we're getting additional value from that person, but that's just one of many ways that we are trying to improve the skills gap and address the skills gap across the board, because it's from our officers that do the inspections right the way across to the engineering support. And if you have one without the other, you're always going to run into difficulties out there.
And so finally from me in this group of questions, what are the challenges that you would say that sort of high-rise residential buildings pose for firefighting, including obviously we've got this huge number of buildings going up in London, timber frame buildings, we've got the combustible ACM materials on them. We've also got people deciding that they've got an office block that they've now want to use permitted development to turn that into new residential. What would you say are the sort of the key challenges facing you there?
So, is it about the firefighting, your part
Yes.
of the question? So, I think from a firefighting perspective, we've got well-laid procedures around how to tackle fires in high-rise buildings. There will inevitably, over the next few months, be recommendations from Phase 1 of Grenfell that will point to lessons learned for the organisation. I'm sure we'll take those on board, as we always do, and try and learn from them. I think the thing we mustn't lose sight of, and certainly appeal to the panel on this, is that we don't lose sight of the fact that this isn't a question around how we fight fires in tall buildings. It's fundamentally about the building safety underneath that. It'd be very easy to think that there are recommendations for London Fire Brigade or any other fire service that will change the way we tackle fires in high-rise buildings. But fundamentally, if the building's unsafe, if the building doesn't behave in a predictable way, doesn't behave in the way it should, doesn't keep people safe, there is no safety net that a fire service can provide. I think it's a hugely important point that we cannot lose sight of, because there is a real risk for me that people think it's job done. Fire Brigade have had a slap, been told what to do, and we're sorted from that point on. It just isn't there. There's a more fundamental issue that we've known about now for in excess of 20 years, and we've been talking about these issues. I think you look back over fire safety legislation, it is littered with fire safety disasters. I think Nick made the point to me earlier today that those disasters have led to changes in legislation. The real tragedy is that they've only led to changes in that particular area. Bradford Fire leading to Stadia benefits, Rose and Crown leading to issues around hotels. What we've got here is an opportunity to actually affect the whole regulatory regime, to make sure buildings across the piece are safe, not just tall buildings, because that would be the real, I could see the desire to simplify the ask and think about tall buildings. It's about all building types, and particularly those where our most vulnerable live. So I don't want to sidetrack. I'm happy to answer the question about firefighting, but I actually think that's not really the issue here. I wouldn't want to take away from, this is about building safety.
So firefighters are ready to fight fires in tall buildings as they are in other buildings, but the issue for you is not about the readiness of the brigade to respond, it's more about the state of the buildings and improving those in the light of Larkanale, Grenfell and a number of other... Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, just briefly. One of our submissions has been about modern methods of construction, particularly around timber and CLT timber construction. And I think just to echo Dan's point is that firefighters are trained to respond in a certain way. And if even engineers like Harrops are highlighting in their recent report that more research is needed, across the board innovation is moving ahead, which we want to support. But if innovation runs ahead of our knowledge of what these things can do and how they behave in fire, how can we expect our firefighters to always understand what you can't possibly know, because even industry doesn't know those answers yet?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously we did that with ACM in a way, didn't we? We hadn't, the full set of results in terms of how flammable it was only seems to have emerged after Grenfell, and so timber framed and cross laminated timber you think could be deserving of a bit more testing?
all products before they come on the market should go for a proper testing regime. If you talk about medical, you can't put a tablet on the market without going through a full testing. Yet we're allowing we'll test the product and then we'll say, well, that looks a little bit like it, so it must be the same result. And we start with that, and as we go down what was known as desktop studies, the end product is nowhere near what the one that had the test certificate. And that's what we've allowed through not being robust in how we enforce these products, and our building control and other people do not regulate the buildings. And, you know, I'm an ex-firefighter. I don't wear a uniform anymore. But if you build it right and it's constructed right, we have got adequate firefighting techniques and procedures to deal with that. When you don't, that's when things happen. And until you change the mindset of checking and making sure it's checked, bringing back a regulatory framework that is robust enough, and a bit about your difference about AIs and LABC, the trouble is the LABC, the real regulator, are in a competitive market. And if they don't do what the builders want them to do, they won't get the work. And you can't have that. You can't choose your own policeman. It's as simple as that. Fix that.
Could I just come in on the modern methods of construction point, because I think it's very relevant, because the public sector particularly is under a lot of pressure at the moment to use modern methods of construction, and clearly there are advantages in doing it. One of the big issues for us is at the time that it's taken and the lack of capacity around testing of materials. You know, I was looking at something only the other week where, you know, brick slip panels, which should be all right, but we need to get them tested, and you're told, oh, it could take 3 years. Well, this is, you know, so I suspect a lot of developers would go, oh, we'll just use it, it looks all right, and it complies to the current rules. So there's a real issue around capacity of the ability to test new materials in a very, very rapidly evolving market. You know, and CLT is another good example. There are all sorts of pluses coming from one angle onto public bodies saying, oh, use CLT because clearly it's highly sustainable, etc., etc. You know, concrete is a major source of greenhouse gas and other pollution, so you're pushed against using concrete from one angle. But clearly, you know, CLT to a degree is an unknown context in terms of its, you know, fire resistance.
I think we're going to come back to some testing issues later on. Yeah.
But I think what you actually come across is the real nub of the matter. Completely, the regulations of the guidance tend to be locked in time. And developments, like innovation developments, move on quite rapidly, and you're quite right about having testing products and things. But what we're not very good at is testing in combination. It's all right testing an individual product, but how does that behave if it's actually in testing with a number of other products as well? So therein lies the problem. And also the fact that we do have a lack of enforcement. I think the enforcement is pretty weak in England and Wales, certainly. England and Wales, if you breach building regulations, that's a civil matter. In Scotland, it's a criminal case. So they have a completely different approach. Plus the fact in Scotland, you need a warrant to build. You don't need any approval in the UK, in England and Wales, to start building. You can start building tomorrow, so long as you put an application in, you know, to the local authority to tell them. And once they're aware of it, it's up to them to play catch-up. So there's lots of problems with the whole structure of the legislation, the guidance that we get for necessarily satisfying compliance, and the way that we deal with enforcement. Well, that's the real nub of the problem. If we can sort that out, then I think we're a long way to actually getting what we all want, which are safer buildings for everybody.
Well,
better pass over, otherwise my colleagues are going to
Okay,
crucify
just
me.
before we say, a quick question for Dan. You probably won't like it. Did you have better enforcement powers under the 47 Act before it was abolished?
I've got to say it's before my time. I know somebody who was around. But I think it was more. I think it was more linear in many respects. You know, pass and fail. But I can sense Nick's always chomping. So let's
chomping at the bit.
And then I'll give you a personal opinion.
Do you mean more? Was that the Fire Services Act, which is replicated in the Fire and Rescue? Are you talking more around the 71 Fire Precautions Act, which is around building safety? Yes, we had. The problem with the fire safety order is you have to prove serious death or injury to prosecute, which is a very, very high threshold. And I think moving forward, we want much more, not so much on-the-spot fines, but certainly if you haven't got a risk assessment, that's a linear thing. There's no black and white. we should be able to hit you with that. There are certain things that are clear in the order that you could say, you know, bosh kind of thing. Other things a little bit more grey area. But I think we need stronger powers that we've got at the moment, because it relies on a self-regulating system, which is what we've got, only works if you've got a strong enforcement regime. And we haven't. We've got a full self-regulation with a weak regulators.
So if I might, just another frustration with the current process, as Nick said, it's a high tariff, but equally finding the people that are responsible ultimately for the failings is a significant issue. I know we've touched on it earlier, but we've had certain prosecution cases where we've been able to take action against what I would describe as smaller players, smaller offenders in the piece, and yet the real architects of the disaster, of the tragedy, are offshore and outside and out of reach. And even with
that's a general problem in enforcement.
It's a general problem, but it really, for us, in the most serious offences, it really limits where we can act and where we have an impact. And as I say, with everything available to us, we struggle to find that. So I really do think, how do residents, without those other facilities available to them, how do they find the people to complain to is beyond me. And again, we've asked for this to be picked up.
So I'm bringing Susan in now. We've got about another hour to go, and we've got quite a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, I'll be Dan, just very quickly for you. When will the hire ladders procured shortly after Grenfell be operational?
I do have the information here. It's certainly, they've been on order. If you bear with me one moment.
If you keep that page, because I'm also going to ask you where they're going to be located.
So the orders have been placed, and we're expecting the new turntable ladders, the shorter ones, to be around January 2020, and the longer reach ladders will be around March 2020.
And where are they going to be located? Or has that not been decided?
We have looked at locations. I haven't written them down here, unfortunately, but I think they are existing aerial stations across London.
Okay, well, it makes sense.
I don't think we've needed to move them. There has been an assessment of where their impact will be best placed, and actually it hasn't moved them from their locations, but certainly longer reach ones.
Presumably because they're heavy, they'll have to be where the HPs are now, I suppose.
Sorry?
They'll have to put the big ones where the HPs are now, I suppose, because of the weight.
The weight is an issue. We've had heavier vehicles inside London Fire Brigade before, I think, so it's more about where they're going to have an impact and potentially operationally be most useful.
Okay, the last question in this section. Do you still believe that the stay put is the right advice for higher residential fires to keep people the best chance of survival?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's...
No, I'm just asking.
I know you want short answers because we're up against time, but I think it's worth saying that we attend a number of high-rise fires, and in the vast majority of cases, other residents in that building aren't directly affected by that fire or the products of that fire, are unaware, blissfully unaware, that the fire has occurred. So when the building is well maintained, as it was designed to be, with all of those passive fire protection features in place, it's absolutely where we'd want to see the advice going. I think that buildings aren't constructed to fully enable other methods of evacuation to be in place. And I would reiterate, the simultaneous evacuation interim measures are exactly that. They're interim measures. They are not a better option.
Okay. I mean, the problem is you don't know if it's been well maintained. That's the problem. Right, let's leap on to the next one. The next section. In your view, what are the main aspects of fire safety, building regulations and enforcement that need to be changed? So, the two Martins, this is very confusing. We've got two Pats, two Martins. Both Martins, have you a view on this?
Yeah.
Well, obviously you've got a view. A nice, short, concise view would be great. We're running so late.
Non-expert on anything to do with the technical aspects of maintaining buildings. I mean, there has been a lack of connection between the people who live in these buildings and the way these buildings are controlled, and we have to do something to ensure that changes. We also need to address the problems that the fire brigade have in being able to inspect inside of flats, and for property managers the ability to enforce safety within a flat as well as the common areas.
Okay, because we slightly touched on some of this before, Martin.
Yeah, we did touch on it. I think the common thread, the golden thread, I think the so-called golden thread under Hackett is a good idea, make it enforceable. I think we need more streamlined powers of enforcement. At the moment, if under building control, under building regulations, first of all, you have to sort of notify that there's a defect. You have to give the client period of time to correct it. And it's a long drawn-out process, potentially, and it has to go to magistrates' court, being a civil matter. And it takes a lot of time, effort and money for a local authority to actually carry out an enforcement. So I think swifter powers of enforcement, maybe a stop notice, maybe something that's a prohibition notice of some description, that can actually force people to do something fairly quickly.
Yeah.
I think
Couldn't
is
agree with
what's
you more.
necessary. Yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. Have you got anything to add?
Just
Barbara?
clear roles and responsibilities with strong enforcement and sanctions for those who don't do what they're meant to do.
Yeah, good, sound, robust. I'm thoroughly with that. This is for the London Fire Brigade. Do water companies in London adequately discharge their lawful duty to maintain fire hydrants in order for the brigade to fight fires effectively?
It's a very long answer. I'll try and keep it short.
No, it isn't, Dan. It's a yes or no would be good.
In short, we have arrangements in place with water companies, and I think it's fair to say that on the whole, the repairs that we ask for aren't necessarily carried out as quickly or as timely as we would like. I think the provision of water across new developments is still an issue for us as well, in terms of what people are asking for, what consultation goes in. I think water companies are distracted maybe by other priorities around, you know, consumer supply, environmental and leakage priorities that take their focus away from providing for firefighting. And I think that's something that you know, I'd like to see addressed, to help really when we identify where hydrants aren't working or where water supplies aren't as good as they should be. I noticed last night that I think Ofwat's have issued a dictate to water companies to improve low pressure for the vast majority of consumers across Britain. I think hopefully where we have some issues with water supplies, that will go some way to you know, helping us as a byproduct of that.
Have you any idea how many are awaiting repair across London? And what sort of time on average?
So, as of about a week ago, I do have some numbers here. We have open orders, and by that, that's where we've reported a defect, which may be minor all the way through to a completely defective hydrant. So a missing tablet would be something that's minor. There's about 900 hydrants.
900?
About 900. But bearing in mind we have 115,000 hydrants, we believe, across London that sit with the water companies. So it's still a relatively small number, but nonetheless, it's
a reasonable percentage.
in terms of sort of hitting a 60-day target, which is the lower tariff of the targets from Tamik, we're seeing about 25 to 30% of those hydrants being addressed within that time frame.
Is that all?
That's all.
Do you want to name and shame anybody in particular?
Not necessarily.
Now is your opportunity.
I don't think I need to. I think we would probably guess who are the main providers of hydrants across London, but I think it's a more broad issue than looking at the provider that has the most number of hydrants and thinking that's where the issue is, because the issue actually is true for all water providers.
How often do you inspect hydrants? I mean, you've got 115,000 across Londden.
Yep.
How often could each of those be expected to be looked at?
So we have a rolling programme where hydrants are inspected once every 4 years.
Right.
I think that the shame for me, I suppose, is that we can year on year find the same hydrants where it might be a low fault, if you like, a minor fault, and those faults are still in place when crews go out next year. It's I can see why that's a challenge to keep crews motivated to see why this is important. Of course, hydrants are hugely important.
Of course they are, which is why I'm quite appalled by the numbers that you've just read out, to be honest with you. Does the government's building safety programme go far enough to ensure residents are safe and feel safe in their homes? It's quite a broad question, that. It's to all of you, but if anybody's got a specific view.
I'll start, I suppose, by others having a thought on it, but we have been broadly supportive of the government's building safety programme and the Dame Hackett. I think the devil is in the detail, and that's where we're currently working through the consultation document at the moment. I'll be quite frank, the period of time given to us and other consultees to reply is shamefully short. I think we've got 8 weeks for what is potentially the most extensive consultation, and I would argue the most important consultation around building safety we've seen for a number of years. That said, we're with the challenge, because we're the fire brigade, we do. But as I say, the devil is in the detail to ensure that it isn't focused just on high-rise, because there will be a pressure to make sure that's the case, because it's easier to achieve. But actually, this isn't about ease. It's what it comes back to my point earlier. This is our opportunity to fix the system for all building types. So that's where we're trying to encourage. and trying to persuade. There's issues around who the overarching regulator might be and what impact that might have for fire and rescue services in terms of skills that that regulator may draw away from services that still have statutory responsibilities around building safety. And so there's some really key areas within it that we need to focus on and that we'd like to give proper due consideration to in the consultation. But you know, we are where we are. It's 8 weeks, that consultation. I think normally we'd expect 12 to 13 weeks on an average consultation. Given the size of this, I think it's woefully inadequate, but like I say, we will meet the challenge.
Has the Brigade written in and asked for an extension on the time?
I had a conversation over with the Commissioner only last week, and I think the issue for me, if I'm perfectly honest, I'm not sure that extension takes us any further forward. I think the die is cast in many areas, and I think what we need to be focusing on are the key issues that I think we want to see made part of the end product, the solution. And that's around competency across the sector. That's about extending the building types. It's about promoting sprinklers. It's about understanding vulnerability and where fires occurred and making sure those people in our most vulnerable properties are covered off. The number of questions that sit with the consultation, I think, have limited value in terms of shaping the final output. So we are very focused on what the key fire safety principles should be as part of that response.
Thank you. Has anybody else got any other comments?
Yeah, at the RSS we're broadly supportive of the proposal. However, we share Dan's viewpoint about the shortness of the consultation. We're also concerned that what's in the consultation we hope will actually be positive. I've had experience in the past where you've got one consultation document that says one thing and then at the end of it you've something completely different, which was not possibly... Which the old cynic in me says that was the hidden agenda all along, and I'm just not quite sure.
No, and very many of us say that over so very many things, and it's frustrating, and
it is frustrating.
I feel your pain with that. I mean, what more needs to be done as a matter of urgency? Anything that we haven't covered? Because the first question's covered loads, didn't it? No? I'll take that as a no. Now to the Pats and to the Martins. Do you agree with the LFB that sprinklers should be fitted in all-purpose built blocks of flats? I mean, this is a no-brainer, isn't it? I've been fighting for sprinklers forever. Has anybody got any... I mean, do you think sprinklers should always be...
We already said
the answer
that,
should be,
yes.
of course, yes?
I think the only issue is around communal areas, actually, and particularly in terms of people setting them off accidentally, deliberately, etc., and how we deal with communal areas and the technology possibly support that. But I mean, clearly, it's it should be the standard. It should be enforceable.
Yeah.
Just on that, on the sprinklers one, obviously we just recently tragically celebrated the 10-year anniversary of Blacknell House, which is in my part of the constituency in Southwark, and following that, obviously we had the issue where the council did accept liability, but one of the key things from the coroner's report was that they recommended sprinklers. Why do you think, just following on from Assembly Member Hall's question, why do you think that's been ignored to date?
I can't answer for the council as to why it's been ignored. I think the case that Nick alluded to earlier is exactly the case you're talking about, Blacknell House. It's staggering that given the scale of that tragedy, the lessons that ought to have been learned, that actually that recommendation wasn't followed through, and the loophole that was used to not include sprinklers as part of that was the non-worsening clause, as Nick alluded to.
But we'll put some penthouses on the top of it and sell them off. We'll do that, but we won't put sprinklers in that makes people safe. They wouldn't even put in additional dry riser outlets when the pipe was already there, because at the time of the fire, the outlets were on alternative floors, and we asked to put them on every floor, which is literally just drilling a hole into the pipe that's already there. They refused to do that, saying that would be an improvement, and we don't have to do that. And to answer your question, it's because no one can make them do it at the moment, and it costs money. And until they're made to do it, they won't do it. And you know, we'll tell you the same stuff. And like Susan yourself, you're a major advocate for sprinklers. And until they change the law, and it goes back, what could the government have done quicker? They could have changed the regulations on sprinklers quicker. They brought the combustible ban in quick enough. They should have tied into that. And we asked for this, sprinklers in all buildings over 18 metres from new. That would have fixed new buildings going forward, and they could have done retrospective if they wanted. It's a little bit harder, but that would have been something they could have done and can still do now. Don't wait for the whole review of regulations. That's a quick win, and no one can argue that sprinklers aren't effective. The evidence is there and has been for years.
I mean, just in terms of the local authority position, I mean, I think we're probably all fairly clear that sprinklers are a good thing. The cost implications to local authorities with very pressured housing and revenue accounts of installing sprinklers in all their stock is very, very considerable. And I think there should have been attention from government in terms of, either a specific grant to support sprinkler installation or further change in the regulations around the HRA in terms of what you can use money for, because at the time, say the cap has been taken off to it, you were in a capped HRA situation, you couldn't borrow against the HRA, and massive implications. That is why lots of local authorities looked at it and thought if we put it in one block, we have to put it in the lot, and we can't actually afford it without having to put the rents up enormously. So that, there are real issues financially for us on the new build side as well. We are building affordable housing, and we are going to have to, again, a significant increase in our build cost, which puts us into tension in terms of the rental levels that we can deliver because of putting sprinklers in. And again, there is no external support from government or acknowledgement from that. It's just get on with it and do it.
Yeah, the Secretary of the State at the time did indicate that he would look at changing the legislation, and then failed to do so. I think for those reasons, that it was in the period of time when it was, and it just, as all these things do, it just slipped off the political agenda.
Okay, well, I think you'll gather by us, we all absolutely support sprinklers, and we've been, Nick, we've been banging on about this for years. But of course there is the resource implications, and they are quite substantial. What are the immediate barriers to remediate the high-rise buildings with unsafe cladding, and what can be done to address that?
Cost.
All of you, really. Well, maybe a couple of you.
Government's got itself into a complete bind as to what happens. When we first went to see the Housing Department in 2017 after Grenfell, we said, this has opened up a Pandora's box, and it's going to get much, much worse. We're now in a position where the Secretary of State got an agreement to find 200 million out of the department's own budget to fund the private blocks, sometime after they'd agreed to help fund the social blocks. But in doing so, he was required to sign a letter by the permanent secretary, Melanie Dawes, to say that his use of the money was in breach of government spending rules, and that there would be no further funding for other forms of cladding. Now, everyone knows that we are likely to get other types of cladding found to be unsafe. So we're back where we were in 2017. Nobody's sure how it's going to be funded. And we have a whole group of people who are suddenly going to be living in blocks which are deemed to be unsafe. We will have more waking watch. We will have people who can't sell their homes if they own them. They can't move if they're renting their homes. And, they face all sorts of mental stresses. And we should have got to a better solution by now. We need to find a long-term method of supporting our high-rise buildings. They've already begun to move to that in some of the other countries where they require developers to set aside funding to put into a bond system so that can help cover costs of defects that may arise during the building's life. We need that over here at some point. There is no other way. It's fairly obvious the government cannot keep finding money to fund different sorts of defects in buildings, but we also can't just put those costs onto the individual people who may own flats in these buildings, whether it's in the social sector and they've got a right to buy flat, or whether it's in the private sector.
My next question is, how much of a risk does other combustible non-ACM cladding and materials present? But because we won't really know the answer to that.
Well, we don't. I think we're on the cusp of really a whirlwind in this case, quite honestly. And the insurers are not helpful either. On this, they've backed off big style. And nobody seems to be taking responsibility. I've been involved in one case in the north of England where the developer and the insurance company, the warranty provider, have been taken to court, and they think it's far better to outspend the court case by delaying tactics so that they don't have to do anything. They think it's far better because once they admit liability and once they admit that they've got to do this, the cost is phenomenal. They just won't be able to afford it. So it's in litigation with, they're just outspending legal fees.
Yes. I mean,
this is a problem. Nobody will accept responsibility.
So would you say that was the main thing at the moment? People need to take responsibility and find the funding?
Yeah. And I think government, and I think as Martin's clearly said, government clearly are not taking responsibility because they're in a mess. They don't know which way to turn. The recent guidance note that the MHCLG has issued on wooden cladding is causing no end of problems and confusion. So even the guidance that's just come out from the ministry is just causing confusion and problems.
Does anybody know, I mean perhaps the fire brigade know, do you know how many blocks have had cladding removed because of the funding from the government?
I don't think we have those numbers at the moment.
They are released by MHCLG on a monthly basis, aren't they? They have stats of how many have actually been remediated in the public sector. I think there's only 2 in the private sector.
14 where they've started remediation of ACM cladding out of 142.
Yeah.
142 left.
Yeah.
So 10%.
10%.
And then, as you said, there'll probably be more being added when other systems are just as combustible.
Yeah. Okay.
Just a couple of points to follow on from Susan's questions. I think the government started testing other types of cladding 2 or 3 months ago. My understanding is that they're testing the flammability of the materials, but not the fumes and gases that are given off. Is that right, or don't we know?
Yeah,
That's probably the best place.
Yeah, that's not part of the testing regime of what they're doing. And I suppose there are some issues around the flame retardants that are used in properties to make them more fire resistant, give off toxic chemicals. But you know, you've got to balance that with if they don't spread the fire, people will get out of the building and not take in them toxic fumes. But it's something that needs to be researched. Again, it's a case of I found a really good product that makes a building a product more fire resistant, but I haven't really understand what that is giving off, you know, and it's the same as in our furniture regulations, as Charlie was saying. Some really good stuff. I mean, the furniture regs to me is one of the biggest things that's reduced fire deaths, but the modern methods of the way they use flame retardants and that are causing more issues as well. So again, we need to look at that, you know.
And the other question I was going to ask Dan, going just briefly back to the inspection regime. Obviously looking at ACM clad buildings. Are you looking at other cladding as well when you're doing your inspections or not?
So the cladding sits outside of our role for enforcement,
yeah.
But there is guidance notes and advice notes out there for RPs to look at their cladding systems. Currently that's for buildings over 18 metres, so it's for them to be able to demonstrate that they've got a safe system on their building. I think it's imminent that we'll see that extended to buildings below 18 metres. I think there's a real call for that. So it's not that we'd ignore it, but we'd be looking for some evidence going forward to see how that's been captured within the risk assessment or evidence of. But it's difficult for us because it's not something, it's really clear, it sits outside the RRO.
So it's back to the RPs again?
And we're back to the RPs, and you know, it'd be wrong of me to suggest that IOs are going to win that argument if an RP refuses to provide the information, because it's actually not within our... I
think the real issue as well is you can't look at a building, and I think I'm pretty good in this game, but I can't walk up to a building and go, that's HPL, Class D, it's got that, it doesn't work like that. So you need to take bits off and get it tested. It's as simple as that, really, you know, or not, as the case may be. You know.
Another problem is that of product substitution.
Yeah.
Had instances where a designer has specified a particular product which may well be satisfactory and in compliance, and then through whatever reason, normally called value engineering, the contractor decides to substitute that with another product which is a lot cheaper, but actually looks identical. I mean, this is the point that Nick was saying, that these things you can't tell. they can look identical but perform completely differently. And then unless you happen to, they don't notify, you know, that they're changing the product or whatever. This has happened a lot, actually.
Well, I mean, the case I raised at MQT this morning, I think it's got the full set of the things we've talked about today, in that they've got different cladding put on compared to what was scheduled.
Yeah.
Missing fire breaks.
Yeah.
Air gaps between panels.
Yeah.
Huge bills to leaseholders,
Mm-hmm.
up to £40,000 in some cases. The owner refuses just to rely on the government fund. Looks like they're going to have to pay that sort of money for the ACM cladding, but who knows about the wood cladding that's on the building as well. They've got the full set, I'm afraid.
Yes, yes.
I think if I could just add, Andrew, when we had the Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resiliency's fire safety half day in this room, one of the building control officers gave an example where they'd been able to effectively win a contract to look over a development against private building control officers. But in order to do that, the level of scrutiny they were able to provide in order to successfully win the contract is absolutely minimal. So 8 visits for a development has 8 blocks. Now, through the life of the build of that building, you know, simple maths, 1 visit to that building from the moment the foundations are poured to the time it tops out, and what could be hidden within the fabric of that building over time that then becomes a public safety issue down the line. And that's part of that concern we referenced earlier that just has to be addressed as part of this new regime.
I think there's also the issue around the total performance of cladding systems, regardless of whether the materials themselves are flammable or flame resistant or whatever, in terms of their effect on the spread of fire and everything else. I don't think we fully understand that because the evolution of products that are put on the outside of it, particularly rain screens. Okay, Flo.
Great, thank you. Just wanted to come on to looking at working with local authorities and housing providers. So we've touched on that already. And bear in mind, obviously, the same way you've seen cuts across the fire services, a number of those organisations are dealing with major cuts. Just going on to the fire brigade colleagues first, what additional support do you provide to local authorities, housing providers and the private sector to strengthen their fire policies and practices? Just on a general point, we've got a long history of partnership working both with local authorities and with developers where they reach out to us and we're able to engage, and certainly the proactive work Charlie referenced earlier around trying to almost create a charter mark for safer buildings. But so in general I think we've got a strong record there, but just for some detail, that Charlie represents us at London Councils and has done now for a couple of years. So if I hand across to Charlie, we can talk about some of the issues that we've addressed in that arena.
Yes, so it's quite broad in terms of range, so everything from, because it's never just about the building, it's about the people inside the buildings. So obviously the key issues that we'll discuss and try to share intelligence best practices around things like the cladding, the issues. So things like fire doors have come up consistently. And one thing that we, for example, made the point is obviously we're not telling local authorities how to deal with it, but we would rather have a 25-minute rated fire door with a door closer than one without, an hour fire door without a door closer, because ultimately the whole thing fails if you just leave the door wide open. And then right across the other range of the spectrum, we've had inputs from our community safety team and deputy heads of community safety, because it's also about people's behaviours and trying to give the reason why. So I think with the recent balcony fires, that's a good example. So we're all looking at the cladding and everything else, but then if you've got combustible materials on a combustible balcony and you're using smoking materials, barbecues or anything else like that, it's a problem that we have to address from both ends. So again, part of our monthly meetings with the fire safety group is just to try and ensure that we're linked up between practitioner and our inspecting officers working with the local building authority people and the planning teams and everything else, right the way through to some more high level strategic issues. And obviously that gives us a direct ear of what the current issues are.
That's quite good. Just in terms of looking at the assessments already in place, coming to the 2 Martins now, in your view, if you take into account all the work being done with local authorities, housing associations, everyone, what do you think, what does an effective fire assessment look like, sort of in reality?
It covers all aspects of the fire safety, not just of the building, but the facilities within the building. But it also covers the risks, identifies all the risks, identifies who's responsible for those risks, to deal with them, and then produces a report on how those risks can be managed and mitigated against. And it is quite detailed, and it has to be... A fire risk assessment is quite difficult because it's almost a snapshot in time. Yeah. So it has to take into account what the potential changing situations are within that building. If we deal with a high-rise risk block of flats, it's fairly consistent to the point. But what happens if somebody puts something in the common areas? As happens quite often. People will bring bikes in or motorbikes in or scooters. They'll bring fire risk stuff in there. They'll store furniture in there when they shouldn't do, in the landings and the staircase. So it's how that's dealt with and who's responsible. Yeah. And then if it's a public building where public have access to it, it's how to identify those changing dynamics when the building is operational or not operational. A supermarket's a good example of that. So the good fire risk assessment will consider the risks and the operations of the building as well as its fabric, its structure and its potential to behave in such a manner.
Well, perhaps the only point I can add to this is the impact that we're seeing as a result of what's happened with the changing understanding of fire risks. In the knock-on impact that's having on insurance and the people's ability to sell their properties. We are beginning to see contents insurers asking for some sort of proof that the building is safe. Okay. We are seeing people who are getting conveyancing solicitors making demands about the safety of the building. And the problem is that property managers in both the social and private sector are not able to offer any guidance beyond what's in the fire risk assessment. Because how do you say nowadays, I know this building is safe because it's got cladding on, which is not ACM? Because if the government decides next week that cladding isn't safe, you're stuck.
I think one of the things you mentioned is about not just identifying a risk, but who's responsible for the risk. I think that's a key issue that's been raised from a number of tenants. And when you look at previous incidents, do you think there's anything that can be learned? So if you've got, I don't know, a group of block of flats or new development and they set out and say this is the risk, do you think there should be flexibility in terms of as and when maybe that will be reviewed? What would be the time frame? You've said that next week the government could change their mind on what's deemed acceptable and what isn't. How do we make sure that risk actually works for everybody?
Yes. No idea.
Yeah.
Although a fire risk assessment is a snapshot in time, unless you make changes to the building, if you get a competent person who does a full fire risk assessment, it should be as good as that time when it's done it, unless the changes take place. I think what we've had a history of is people in the housing sector paying lip service to the fire risk assessment and not seeing it as a holistic thing about how it's all. It's a bit about the physical features of the building and the management of the building, because it's that keeps it up to date and relevant, and it's a whole joint up approach around how you manage the fire risk in your building. Tenants and residents have a part to play in that. What they do in their flats impacts on that building, but they have a right to information to know that the building they are in is as safe as it can be, and the issues that there are. I mean, we're advocating that they are a bit like the eyes and ears, and if you had some kind of rating system they could understand in that building about, and also around what is wrong with that building. I could walk around this building and find some issues with it, I'm pretty sure, but it's how that risk is. And secondly, the time scales I've got to deal with them buildings. And what you've got with large housing providers is they've got a massive portfolio of buildings, and they rush around fixing one building when we're not looking at a holistic view of their whole building stock. And understanding where the risks are and prioritising their limited resources to fix the big risks rather than fixing a building at a time. fix the big risk. And Charlie, who manages our business support group, we were the first fire service who entered into primary authority partnerships with housing to give them that assistance, to understand that you're managing a risk profile, not an individual building. And that's the way to do it correctly.
And if I could just add to that, part of the challenge is not just taking those who take fire safety seriously, it's sometimes about partnering up with some of the more challenging people, because safety is a culture. It's not about just what's the least I can do to gain compliance, it's about trying to work with these people and bring them on board.
There is also a rather fundamental problem we have with the legislation, in that with lots of buildings, you may not actually have the right to improve, to reduce the fire risk.
We're going to come on to that. So just following on from what you were talking about there, Nick, and I will confess that I've seen a good example of this when there was an issue in the block of flats that I lived in, and the brigade were called out and got telling off by the firefighter that came because of the location of where our smoke alarm is. So, then, there's so much you can learn. How does the brigade respond to fire safety concerns by residents? And in essence, it's about the fantastic work you do on the open days. Again, I've been to a number of them, West Norwood Fire Station, Old Kent Road Fire Station. But what more does the brigade do to respond to those concerns from residents?
I think there's, I mentioned right at the start, we've got a great record, I think, of our prevention and preventative activities. The home fire safety visits being a key one of those, where we sort of target, say, most vulnerable people, but equally offer a service where it's not just about fitting the smoke alarm, it's about providing key advice. And that's one of the things that we find most challenging, to ensure not only that residents understand it's not about getting a free smoke alarm, and our firefighters actually, that they're there to impart advice and learning from previous incidents. So the advice that we give is informed by what we know about the built environment, what we know about behaviours, and what we know about the common causes of fire. So our fire investigation team, for example, gone are the days where we accept as a throwaway calls, not known. It's much more forensic now. I think our total recalls campaign is evidence of that. We're able to identify down to the component that was a cause, and then identify brands, and that campaign is well known to you in terms of the effort that's gone to keeping people safe. But equally around balcony fires, we've just used some of the reinvestment around enhancing our inspection regime. Officers that now work within FIT to carry out further studies around balcony fires to understand the behaviours that are triggering the risk for residents, so that they are better informed around what to not do to keep themselves safe from fire. Yeah. So there's a comprehensive thing. We do fatal fire reviews to learn from those processes. It's an important part. We do post-fire safety audits on premises involving fire. All of that creates a nice cyclical pattern where we learn from fires to inform the messages that are important, not just for residents to keep themselves safe, but also, I think you were talking about property owners. What are the key issues there? When we had the Shepherd's Court fire, I wrote to local authorities around the spandrel infill panels that was a source of fire spread on the external part of that building. That's about learning and sharing information as we go. So there are a range of activities. We engage with care providers, we engage with carers. We've used innovative ways through the Community Safety Investment Fund to drive new initiatives around personal protective systems. We engage with Telecare Service Association to put online training available for carers to make sure that they were well informed around what are the fire risks for our most vulnerable. And that's something that we are committed to doing, and it's something that we continue to do. Charlie's just reminded me a good example of that, of prevention of future fire death letters that we write to coroners. That's a result of our fatal fire reviews. Okay. We've had some significant successes there around emollients, airflow mattresses, and advising people, not just in London but nationally, around where those risks exist and what carers and family members, and those eyes and ears that Nick talked about, that are engaged with people most at risk from fire, to be able to identify those risks and prevent the fire happening. And
that, like I said, it's really good that there is a range of engagement going on, and not just looking at the stats that we probably received direct from the LFB in terms of how many fires across London and fatalities, but how else do you measure the success of the engagement work that you're
I
doing?
think it's really difficult, and it's certainly an ongoing challenge for us, because you don't know what hasn't happened because of what you've done.
Yeah.
What I would point to is the historical correlation really between activities such as the furniture regs that Nick talked about, where those advances in what we'd learnt from fires has had, but equally the time at which fire services truly engaged in community safety activities. There's an absolute correlation there between a reduction in fire deaths and injuries over that period of time. But we do try to evaluate stuff. We're currently evaluating the impacts of the Community Safety Investment Fund to see what benefits have been had from that. But it is always a challenge in that arena, absolutely.
Another challenge, again, we've touched on it earlier, is just the fact that I mentioned that a number of local authorities and housing providers seen a reduction in their funding, and they've made cuts. In my view, in some areas, which is really critical. So you look at building control, planning departments. Do you feel that that's had an effect on fire safety measures that you're trying to implement?
Absolutely. I think we've sort of covered some of that earlier.
Yeah.
I think everyone's feeling that pressure, and I understand that. And I think one of the things that's always frustrated me is certainly from my time as a first officer working at fire stations in Hackney, is you'd attend local community activities around prevention, and people are much more concerned about crime and whether their bins get emptied and things like that. And so it's a very easy task when fire isn't high on people's agenda to look to reduce those activities. And in local authorities, was building control such an issue when you don't get lots and lots of building failures? Yet we've been pointing to those issues for, as I say, in excess of 20 years. London Fire Brigade's got evidence of writing to local authorities, to building developers, to say these are the issues we're finding and you need to be addressing them. So I think it's just a sad fact that, an example of that was some of the engagement we did immediately following Grenfell Tower. We were attending meetings with local authorities and with private building developers where there was standing room only.
Yeah.
And sadly, by Christmas, we were attending the same meetings with 12 people in the room. It's remarkably quick how people's memories fade and priorities, other priorities overtake.
Come and take over.
What is good to see is that energy has been returned to that room, because we have now got the challenges around the further issues around cladding. We've got the challenges that will be posed by the new regulatory regime, and people want to know where we sit and what our advice is, and that's why we've maintained a presence at London councils, and I'm sure if you talk to colleagues in local authorities that they would welcome the contribution Charlie and colleagues have made in that arena.
As much as it's a terrible tragedy, how it impacted people, the Barking and Dagenham fire, you can't help but think, I personally can't help but think actually it was a timely reminder that we're just getting, as Dan said, we're just getting over that slope where it's almost getting to business as usual, but actually there's still a huge amount of work to do. So, but for the grace of God, you never want an incident like that to happen again. But as I say, personally, I think massive impact on the community and the people aside. I think it's a necessary reminder that there's still a huge amount to do, and if we don't do it, we're in trouble.
I'll just add to that, because I don't want people thinking it's business as usual for London Fire Brigade. We talk about business as usual in other people's arenas. We've talked at some point about the slowness of the pace of change and what still needs to be done. I can certainly vouch that in terms of London Fire Brigade, I've never been so busy. I've never been so busy for a sustained period. And I'm immensely proud to be in charge of fire safety and the team that are working at such a pitch and have done continuously for over 2 years now. And largely, with the frustrations of knowing they pointed to these issues well before, and yet they've stayed on the task. So.
Thank you. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Sorry, Tony. Tony wants to come
sorry,
in.
Tony wants to come up.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions about fire doors. You've just told us you've never been so busy about fire safety. I want to ask you about being busy about fire doors. I understand that 5 suppliers who provide fire doors have been identified as failing to meet fire performance standards. What work is being done to find out what doors have been supplied by these suppliers, and how we're making sure that they're being replaced? This is an investigation by DCLG.
Yeah, so I'll offer that to Nick in his work alongside NFCC, working the expert panel. It's something that certainly went through there.
It goes back again to, we know, a lot of local authorities know they have purchased these doors, but have no idea where they've put them in their buildings because they don't keep records. So it becomes, and again, it's a composite door, looks like a composite door, it's a plastic door. So these can be very difficult for them to decide what are the good ones and what are the bad ones. I think, though, what you've got to understand without being too technical, is the fire test is a really high standard. It's 30 minutes of a compartment fire. In other words, the whole flat alight basically for 30 minutes. And going back to what Charlie said, if you've got a good self-closer on it, it fits in the hole, as I'll be less technical, that will provide adequate time for people to escape and for firefighters to do their role. It's again around testing, and there should be a program to replace these doors in a kind of risk assessed way. There is some work being done by the government at the moment to provide information to the building owners to say, look, if it's this type of door and you follow this kind of flow chart, it'll say remediate or replace, or remediate or replace over the lifetime of the building. But number one priority is to ensure it's got a self-closer on it, because a 10-minute door is better than the best fully tested door that hasn't got a self-closer on it, you know. So do them bits first, and they're the advice that's given. I think, again, it's just another example of a market that's allowed products to go on from a test certificate that the door originally passed, and then someone said, I'm going to put a bit of glazing on that, that'll be all right. I'm going to do this on it, that'll be all right. And so the product that now ends up on the market is not the one that was tested, but they're hiding behind the original test certificate. And again, this, you know, this is what you're going to find. It's not, it'll be something else.
Okay, I follow all that. There's a related question. I think on the Chalcott Tower block, they found that the fire doors were missing. I have a note here which says that there were 1,000 fire doors missing from the Chalcott Tower block.
1,000 or not 1,000 flats.
No. I think there's a bit myself, because I attended Chalcott's myself. There was probably over the range of blocks a large number of doors that were ineffective, non-fire rated. There was a couple missing. It's not normally the front door of a flat. No one tends to lose the front door of their flat. Yes, it's normally a cross corridor door or a cupboard door. But again, it's around making sure that the responsible person is regularly checking. And I'm sure in that particular state, residents complained about doors missing, doors broken, and even post-Grenfell it was difficult for that to do. But they've now, Camden has made a real effort to really improve their stock and spent a lot of money, invested wisely, but they're playing catch up. If you don't invest in something for many, many years, you pay double trying to fix it in the future.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, I understand that. Thanks very much.
Jeremy.
Thanks very much. Just on the subject of engagement, which we were talking about, obviously the government has come up with its proposals for improving resident engagement or changing the way that resident engagement is done. And I just wondered how much consultation there has been so far with residents over the proposals, and I suppose I'm putting that to Martin Boyd and then yep. Pat and Pat.
The MHCLG is about to initiate a set of roadshows to go out and speak to residents.
So they've launched them, but they haven't done the roadshows yet. They are imminent, and there is a meeting at MHCLG next week as well. I mean, the question perhaps to be asked is, they've called it the resident's voice. I haven't quite understood what they are intending by that. You know, residents obviously, you know, there is a lot to be done in helping people understand why they've got to be more aware of fire risks in communal buildings. But we are obviously not going to be asking residents to actively participate in suggesting future safety measures in buildings. We have experts for that. Okay, but effective resident engagement over these issues is surely important, and they have come up with this sort of list of things about accessing more detailed information, having an accountable person with overall responsibility for safety. The accountable person must include resident engagement amongst their tasks. I mean, I don't know how much residents were consulted before this list was drawn up by MHCLG. you're shaking your head. Pat, have you got any idea if residents were actually consulted? No, you don't think so either. Okay, so this list has come up from bureaucrats in MHCLG and is now going to go out through roadshows. Does this sound like effective engagement to you? Other things?
That's not true. There is there is a best practice group that's full of residents.
Full of residents.
That have come up with some of these suggestions. There was the social paper on housing that formed it. And they said they've set this best practice group that has been engaged for at least 18 months that I'm aware of. And some of the suggestions in the consultation come directly from them. Now they've done I hate sticking up for government, sorry, for MHCLG, but they've even done an easy access to the consultation, particularly for residents on their website, because it's 190 odd pages, but they've done a quick read for residents. But they're doing further roadshows to engage. I think the
Are you referring to the Building a Safer Future?
Yes.
A quick read guide.
Yes.
Just 190 pages.
No. That's what it is. But they've now done an easy guide, which is a lot less than that.
Okay.
They haven't engaged well enough, I don't think, with the private sector. I think that's where they need to improve more.
Oh, okay, so you think it's been more with tenants
More
than
tenants,
with leaseholders?
yes, yeah,
I can see Pat,
leaseholders, yeah.
as in Turnball, is now desperate to come in and say something as well.
So I didn't know about the about the best practice group of residents, and I think that's one of the problems. I mean, London Tenants Federation is still in London probably the nearest to a democratic organisation of council tenants and leaseholders. But I would say that the weakening of tenant organisation as a whole is bound to affect the ability of tenants to respond to the maintenance of their own homes. And we haven't got as many tenants and residents associations in London as we used to have. We haven't got as many borough federations as we used to have. And all these things are ways in which tenants can meet together, can see what the problems are, can share information about the problems, and can respond to them.
I appreciate what you're saying.
And I think this is an absolutely
but you're straying into housing committee territory here, I think.
Well, yes.
Which I also sit on. I'm very happy to take it back to the housing committee. I'm just conscious, this is my second set of questions, and I don't want to be massacred by my colleagues for going into a slightly wider response there. I think the important issue is the roadshows, whether it is accessible for people to respond to. I appreciate that might be in the context of a sort of slightly less resourced tenant structure where people can get together. Do you think there's now, what would effective consultation look like? Is it going to be sufficient to just do it through the website and these roadshows? And do you think that the proposals that have come out of MHCLG sound about right to you at this point, or do you think there's going to be lots of comments?
I think there's a bit of a problem in that we've got different bits of government facing in different directions. There was.
Well, that's never happened before.
No, of course not.
Clearly
no.
not.
But we had a statutory instrument introduced last October on recognised tenants associations, which everyone accepts has now made it more difficult to form residents groups. And we have the work of the building safety team saying we must engage more effectively with residents. So if you've made it more difficult for them to form residents group, and it's absolutely true that you are not going to get the flow of information coming through these consultations long term. It is only going to happen because either the people who run the buildings are managing to get information across to the people who live there, or the residents themselves are helping to pass that information over. And if you don't use both of those, we're going to get inefficiencies in the system.
So can I ask you directly, what's your own view then of the proposals that have come out from MHCLG so far? Do you think they're any good?
I think there's more work to be done on them.
More work to be done. Pat, is that a view that you would personally share? Is that something?
I think so. I mean, I think they're certainly a step in the right direction. I think the thing I would say as well is that there was actually a lot of good practice. I think they've drawn into some of that. But really was post-Lacanal, actually, from local authorities who really had to start to address some of these issues around how you work with tenants and residents around things like what you can store on your balcony, that you can't have security gates and things like that, which obstruct access. So I think there is a lot of good practice out there which could be tapped into better. I also think that there is a genuine issue of raising capacity in the private sector now. It's one of the things that we've found, that there's a lot of good practice in the public sector. There's also some poor practice, but there is, with the growth of the private rented sector and the exponential growth of the private rented sector, there are now a lot more people in that space, and I think that because they're again relatively new entrants into it, so there's a lot I think to be done in terms of improving the quality and the knowledge of some of the people involved in managing now what are very large private centre rented blocks. But previously, the private rented sector was very much concentrated in this, effectively house market, terraced houses, small flats, etc.
So I think that's a very well made point about expanding it. Pat, I'll just maybe finish with you. The government said the views and concerns of residents should never be ignored by those responsible for managing the safety of their buildings. We will give residents a stronger voice and allow them to hold those responsible for the safety of their buildings to account. Residents will be empowered by having better access to information about their building and have more of a say over decisions about fire and structural safety. Residents will be at the heart of the new regulatory system. Does that all sound as though it's about to happen to you?
Well, let's live in hope, shall we?
Always, Pat. Well, I think we can live in hope, but I sincerely hope that's not where the fire brigade are coming from. I think, making sure that we've done everything that we can so that we can be as safe as possible rather than living in hope. But thank you. I'll leave it there, Andrew.
Well, just some wrap-up questions. One question I was going to ask is how many of the statements in the Brigade's closing statement to Grenfell have actually been actioned, but I think we've got quite a long appendix to our brief that actually answers that question, so we could perhaps read that into the notes. Sort of a general wrap-up question, very quick answers please. What's the immediate next steps in fire safety and what can the Mayor do to promote it?
I think the common areas that we've been talking around, so greater competency across the sector, better regulation, more robust testing, they're the key areas for us that would underpin whatever else is happening out there. I think we've talked about vulnerabilities and people's behaviour, so ensuring people at the centre of risk assessments and included as part of that risk assessment who lives, uses, works and plays in these buildings to make sure that they are adequately, their needs are adequately met and addressed. And I think things around sprinklers, Nick mentioned it earlier, a very quick win here is to keep pushing for sprinklers in buildings. They are not a silver bullet, we're not pretending they are. They need to be part of a holistic set of fire safety measures. Buildings that fail to perform as we'd expect will overrun a sprinkler system. So I'm not going to sit here and say it's the only answer, but it's certainly a quick win that I think we could move forward on.
Okay, thanks very much. Have any of you got anything additional to what Dan has said?
Yeah, there are two things. One I'd say is information. It's been very clear that there's been a lack of information and lack of understanding about what's happened on our buildings across the capital. The local authorities all went out and collected information on how many ACM cladding sites they've got. The chances are they're all going to have to go back again and collect yet more information. And the Mayor and the GLA seems to have a strategic role in that for the capital. And the other thing is we need to do something more to start engaging with residents more effectively, because that's become a problem across both the private and social sectors.
Yeah. If I could just make one point, I think it is about the need to look again at the regulations covering building control services and the recognition by government that actually building control shouldn't just be something which developers purchase from who they want to. It is part of a very important regulatory function and should be treated as that. So the fact that local authorities they can only recover the costs from it and have to compete for all the work should be, I think, urgently reviewed, because at the moment you have effectively the role of potentially appointing their own policemen, and that needs to change. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Pat. Quick.
Well, just to say that we are having a meeting about this tomorrow, and after that, London Tenants Federation will put in its own response, but also it'll do a model response which it'll send out to its member organisations as a sort of prompter to encourage people to put in responses as well.
Okay, well, perhaps you copy us in on that. Okay, well, can I thank you all for your contributions? We've got a few more formal items on the agenda we have to go through, which you're welcome to stay for. It'll take about 30 seconds. Can we note the action taken under delegated authority by the Chair in consultation with group party leads to agree the areas of consideration as set out in paragraph 4.1 of the report?
Noted.
Can we note the report in today's discussion?
Agreed.
Yes.
Can we also delegate authority to me as Chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from the meeting?
Agreed.
And item 7, can we note the Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee work programme?
Noted.
And can we also agree in relation to urgent matters only, a general delegation of authority in respect to the committee's powers and functions, apart from those that cannot under the Policing and Crime Act 2017 be delegated to the Chair, in consultation with the Deputy Chair and Party Group Lead members from the close of this meeting until the committee's next formal meeting on the 26th September 2019.
Agreed.
Thank you. And the next meeting is Thursday, the 26th of September at 2 p.m. At the moment it's here, but we may move it somewhere else. Thank you all.
Thank you.
No other business.
GLA Chamber Sound.